What happens when the person you built an empire with tries to erase you in a single public act of betrayal? Tonight, we delve into the story of Ilara Vance, the silent architect behind tech mogul Julian Croft's meteoric rise. At New York's most exclusive charity gala, in front of the city's power brokers and media sharks, Julian made a declaration. He stood on stage, a champagne flute in hand, and introduced his young, glamorous mistress as his wife. But he made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed the real Mrs. Croft would crumble. He forgot who she was. This isn't a story of a woman scorned. It's the story of a queen taking back her kingdom one devastatingly brilliant move at a time. Stay tuned. The silence in their Fifth Avenue penthouse was a physical entity. It had weight and texture, a cold, smooth surface like the marble floors that stretched through the cavernous space. It was a silence bought and paid for by Aethelred Dynamics Julian Croft's technology empire, a name that evoked ancient power for a company that traded in the ephemeral currency of data and algorithms. Ilara Vance, his wife of 12 years, had suggested the name, pulling it from an obscure text on Anglo-Saxon kings. Julian had loved it. He'd loved her mind once. Now that mind was a utility he took for granted, like the skyline view that glittered like a carpet of fallen stars outside their floor-to-ceiling windows. Ilara sat in the Eames chair in the corner of the vast living room, a first-edition copy of a Virginia Woolf novel resting in her lap. The book was a shield. Behind it, her mind was not on Bloomsbury, but on the micro-expressions she had catalogued from her husband over the past 6 months, the slight, almost imperceptible tightening at the corner of his eye when she entered a room unexpectedly, the way his thumb swiped left on his phone screen with a practiced, furtive speed, the new vocabulary of corporate jargon that was peppered with phrases he'd clearly borrowed from someone else, someone younger, someone more digitally native. Julian paced by the windows, his own phone pressed to his ear. He was a man sculpted by success. Custom Tom Ford. Suit, a Patek Philippe watch that was a subtle nod to his 7-figure bonus, a predatory energy that he'd once turned on the world for them, but which now felt perpetually aimed in her direction. No, Marcus. The valuation is non-negotiable, he said, his voice a low, confident growl that had charmed boards and investors alike. We're not just acquiring their hardware, we're acquiring their market position. It's a power play. Ilara didn't look up, but her focus sharpened. He was talking about the Aerion Labs acquisition. She had spent 3 weeks doing the deep dive analysis, pulling apart their financials, their patent portfolio, and their supply chain vulnerabilities. She had flagged a critical issue, a dependency on a single-source materials provider in a politically unstable region. She had written a 12-page memo on it, advising a renegotiation of terms or a structured escrow account to mitigate the risk. They'll cave. Julian continued, oblivious to the architect of his strategy, sitting 10 feet away. We have all the leverage. He hadn't read the memo. She knew it with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the pit in her stomach. He had likely had his new assistant, the one with the impossibly white teeth and a master's in brand synergy, summarize it in 5 bullet points. Or perhaps he'd had Kimberly summarize it. Kimberly Sterling. The name itself felt like a cheap perfume. Ilara had found her Instagram profile months ago. It was a curated masterpiece of ambition. Kimberly on a yacht in Monaco. Kimberly at a gallery opening in Chelsea. Kimberly sipping an espresso at a ridiculously trendy cafe. A laptop open to a presentation with the Aethelred logo faintly visible in the background. She was a strategic communications consultant, a title as vague and meaningless as it was ubiquitous in their circle. She was also Ilara knew the reason for the late-night calls Julian took on the terrace and the faint scent of Baccarat Rouge 540 that sometimes clung to his suits. Julian ended his call and tossed the phone onto a glass table with a sharp clack. The sound ricocheted in the quiet room. "Big night tomorrow," he said, striding over to the bar and pouring himself a whiskey. He didn't offer her one. He hadn't in a long time. The Starlight Gala. Ilara said her voice even. She finally closed her book, marking her page. "I was looking at the auction catalogue. The Matisse sketch is interesting. It's a circus." He waved a dismissive hand. "All the same people writing the same checks to feel good about themselves. Listen about tomorrow." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, not meeting her eyes. "I think you should sit this one out." The pit in her stomach turned to ice. "Oh, I thought we were co-chairing the technology sector donations. She thought I'm the one who secured the pledges from half of Silicon Valley." "Things are shifting, Ilara. The brand, the image, it's all about forward momentum, youth, energy." He finally looked at her, and his gaze was appraising, as if she were a piece of furniture he was considering replacing. "Your style is classic, timeless, and that's great. But we need to project dynamism." Kimberly Sterling. She's handling our PR for the event. She thinks we need a more unified front. Unified front. The corporate euphemism was so insulting it was almost comical. He was telling her to stay home so he could bring his mistress. The audacity of it, the sheer unadulterated hubris, was breathtaking. Ilara felt a strange calm descend over her. The hurt was there, a deep tectonic ache, but it was being overlaid by something else, a cold, crystalline anger. She had been a ghost in this marriage for a year, an uncredited co-author to his success story. He thought she was a part of the decor, an elegant but faded fixture. He had forgotten that she had designed the house. "I see," she said, her voice betraying nothing. "You need to project a certain image. I understand completely." He looked relieved, a flicker of surprise in his eyes that she wasn't arguing. "Exactly. Thank you for understanding, Ilara. It's just business." "Of course," she said, rising from her chair with a grace he had long stopped noticing. "Everything is." She walked towards their bedroom, her back straight, her steps measured. Julian, already turning his attention back to his phone, missed the look in her eyes. It was the look of a strategist who has just seen the entire battlefield with perfect clarity. He thought he was making a power play. He had no idea that he had just handed her the opening move in a war he didn't even know was coming. Later that night, long after Julian had fallen asleep in one of the guest rooms, a habit he'd developed over the past few months, Ilara sat at her vanity. She wasn't looking at her reflection. She was looking at her phone. She scrolled past the dozens of unread messages from friends and acquaintances and opened a secure encrypted messaging app. There were only 3 contacts in it. One was a private investigator she had hired 2 months prior. The second was a man named Arthur Finch, a legendary but reclusive financial journalist. The third was a woman named Evelyn Reed, the 80-year-old matriarch of one of New York's oldest and most respected philanthropic families. She typed a simple message to Evelyn. "Evelyn, my apologies for the late hour. About the gala tomorrow. I have a small surprise I'd like to announce. Will you be presenting the keynote address before the main auction as planned?" A reply came back almost instantly. "For you, my dear. I'd wrestle the microphone from the mayor himself." "What do you have in mind?" Elara smiled a slow, dangerous curve of her lips that the mirror reflected back at her. Julian wanted to project a new image. She would help him. She would give him, and all of New York, an evening of branding they would never forget. The Astoria Grand Ballroom was a cathedral of obscene wealth. Gilded Rococo plasterwork dripped from the ceiling, and chandeliers the size of small cars shed a brilliant diamond-hard light on the city's elite. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 competing perfumes and the low hum of self-congratulation. This was the Starlight Gala for Children's Futures, an event where titans of industry and old-money scions paid $50,000 a table to publicly absolve themselves of the sins of capitalism. Julian Croft arrived with Kimberly Sterling on his arm, and a tidal wave of flashbulbs preceded them. They were a vision of modern power. Julian, in his perfectly tailored Brioni tuxedo, looked every inch the tech king. Kimberly was breathtaking in a crimson sequined gown that was less a dress and more a statement. It hugged every curve, plunged daringly at the neck, and was clearly chosen to be photographed. She laughed a little too loudly, her hand possessively on Julian's bicep, her eyes scanning the room. Not for friends, but for cameras. She was playing the part of Mrs. Croft with a ravenous, desperate energy. They made their way to the central table, where Julian was holding court with a U.S. senator and the CEO of a rival tech firm. He leaned in, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "Senator, I'd like you to meet my wife, Kimberly," he said, beaming. "The brilliant mind behind our new philanthropic strategy." The senator, a man who had known Elara for years and had once sought her advice on tech policy, blinked in confusion. He looked from Kimberly's dazzling vacant smile to Julian, a question mark hanging in the air. But Julian's sheer confidence was a force of nature. He barreled past the awkwardness, launching into a story about a recent trip to Davos, with Kimberly nodding along as if she'd been there. The lie was so bold, so audacious, that it almost created its own reality. People were confused, whispering, but no one dared to challenge Julian Croft at the apex of his power. It was precisely at that moment of manufactured triumph that Elara Vance arrived. She did not make an entrance. She simply appeared. While Kimberly was a firework, Elara was the night sky. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue silk, a custom design by a couturier so exclusive he didn't have a label. It was deceptively simple, with a clean sculptural cut that whispered of immense expense rather than shouting it. Her only jewelry was a pair of sapphire and diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, and a simple platinum band on her left hand. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon, and her face was calm, her expression serene. She radiated a stillness that was more commanding than any noise. She didn't walk towards Julian's table. Instead, she entered and paused, allowing the room to register her presence. A photographer from the Times, a veteran who recognized real power when he saw it, turned his lens from Kimberly and took a single, perfect shot of Elara, standing alone. The whispers in the room changed frequency. They went from confused speculation to sharp electric gossip. Two Mrs. Crofts. What was happening? Julian saw her. His smile faltered for a microsecond, a crack in the polished veneer. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Kimberly, following his gaze, saw Elara, and her perfectly applied smile tightened, a look of pure venom flashing in her eyes before being replaced by practiced indifference. Elara ignored them. Her gaze swept the room, and she began to move, Her first stop was not a confrontation, but a quiet conversation. She approached a table where Charles Baring, a notoriously grumpy hedge fund manager, was sitting. "Charles," she said, her voice a warm murmur, "I was so pleased to see the Baring Foundation was a lead sponsor tonight." Charles, who had been scowling at his soup, looked up. "Elara, I didn't expect to see you. Julian was just—" "Business is business," Elara said smoothly, giving him a knowing look that absolved him of any awkwardness. "But philanthropy is personal. I wanted to thank you personally for your guidance on the offshore fund structuring for the endowment. Your advice was invaluable." Charles's chest puffed out. "Just common sense, my dear. Glad someone listened?" It was a subtle dig at Julian, who had dismissed Charles's advice at a Hamptons brunch a year earlier. Next, she moved to the other side of the room, where she found Evelyn Reed, the matriarch, holding court. Evelyn's ancient eyes, as sharp as a hawk's, twinkled when she saw Elara. "There she is," Evelyn boomed her voice, carrying across the nearby tables. "The woman of the hour." Elara simply smiled and kissed her cheek. "Evelyn, you're too kind. I was just admiring the centerpiece." "Nonsense," Evelyn said, tapping her champagne glass for attention. "Everyone you all know Elara Croft, of course. What you may not know is that it was her tireless behind-the-scenes work that secured the matching grant from the Gates Foundation. Not a press release, not a photo op. Just quiet, brilliant work. The way it ought to be done." A ripple of genuine applause went through that section of the room. Julian, watching from his table, felt a prickle of unease. He had taken credit for the Gates grant in a Wall Street Journal profile. Kimberly, feeling the spotlight shift, tried to reclaim it. She stood up and walked over to a cluster of social media influencers, her crimson dress a beacon. "Isn't this event just everything?" she gushed, pulling out her phone for a selfie. "Giving back is the new luxury. You know, one of the influencers, a sharp-eyed young woman who ran a popular gossip site, looked from Kimberly to Elara and back again. "We're a little confused," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Julian just introduced you as his wife, but that's Elara Vance. She's on the board of the museum." Kimberly's smile didn't waver. "Oh, you know Julian," she said with a practiced little laugh. "He's a visionary. He lives in the future. It was a terrible, clumsy save, and everyone knew it. The performance was starting to fray at the edges. Elara's masterstroke was her conversation with Marcus Thorne. Julian's number 2 at Aethelred, the man Julian had been on the phone with the night before. She found him near the bar, looking deeply uncomfortable. Marcus Elara said gently, "Elara, I'm sorry. I had no idea," he stammered. "There's nothing to be sorry for," she said, her gaze steady and reassuring. "Julian is making a statement. But I wanted to talk to you about another statement, the one Erion Labs is about to make when their sole supplier for cobalt defaults on their next shipment. I assume Julian shared my memo on the political instability in the region." Marcus's face went pale. "What memo?" "The 12-page risk analysis I emailed to him 3 weeks ago," Elara said calmly. "The one that advised building in a 40% price buffer and securing a secondary supplier before the acquisition. He did get that, didn't he? Because if he signed that deal on the original terms, your entire hardware division is exposed. Shareholder value could take a 9-figure hit." Marcus looked like he was going to be physically ill. He mumbled an excuse and hurried away, pulling out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. Elara had not raised her voice. She had not cried or caused a scene. She had simply walked through the room and dismantled her husband's empire, piece by piece, with the quiet, devastating power of the truth. The seeds were sown. All she had to do now was wait for the harvest. The main course, a filet mignon that cost more than most people's weekly grocery bill, was being served, but few were eating. The atmosphere in the Astoria Grand Ballroom was charged, the air humming with the unspoken tension. Julian Croft, who had started the evening as a conquering king, now looked like a man sitting on a throne of ice that was rapidly melting beneath him. He could feel the shift. The fawning admirers had been replaced by curious onlookers. The respectful deference had curdled into speculative whispers. He kept shooting furious glances across the room at Elara, who was now seated at Evelyn Reed's table, looking perfectly at ease, engaged in an animated conversation with a Nobel Prize-winning economist. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly indifferent to him. It was this indifference that galled him the most. Kimberly, for her part, was trying desperately to shore up their crumbling narrative. She was table-hopping, laughing too hard, touching arms a little too familiarly. Her performance, which had seemed dazzling upon arrival, now looked what it was, a cheap imitation. "Julian is just so passionate about changing the world," she said to a steely-faced woman who ran a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund. "That's what I love about him. His vision is just so big." The woman, Patricia Lawford, looked at Kimberly with the detached curiosity of a biologist studying a new and particularly colorful insect. "His vision has historically been tempered by Elara's pragmatism," she said, her voice dry as a bone. "She's the one who talked him out of that disastrous social media venture 5 years ago. Saved him $500 million. I know because I was going to short the stock." Kimberly's smile faltered. She had no idea what Patricia was talking about. "Well, the future is now," she offered weakly, before retreating back to Julian's side. "These people are so stuffy," she whispered to him, her voice tight with frustration. "Just smile and look beautiful." Julian hissed back, his own smile a rigid mask. "That's your job." The public humiliation was a slow burn, a fire built with expertly placed kindling. The financial journalist Arthur Finch, a man who could smell corporate rot from a mile away, was observing the scene with undisguised glee. He'd had his eye on Ethelred for a while, sensing that its spectacular growth was fueled by unsustainable risks. He watched Marcus Thorne frantically whisper to 2 other board members, their faces grim. He saw the cold shoulder Julian received from Charles Baring. He saw the genuine warmth and respect afforded to Elara. He didn't need a press release. The story was writing itself in the body language of the most powerful people in New York. The breaking point came during the live auction. The auctioneer, a flamboyant man with a theatrical flair, was trying to whip up excitement for a week-long stay at a private villa in Tuscany. "Do I hear 200,000? He called out, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. From the back, a voice called out, 100,000. And only if the plumbing has been updated since the Renaissance." A wave of laughter rippled through the ballroom. The voice belonged to Harrison Kane, a witty and notoriously sharp-tongued art dealer. He was sitting at Elara's table. The joke was clearly a shared one. It was an inside club moment, and Julian and Kimberly were on the outside. Julian, seeing his control of the evening slipping away completely, decided to force the issue. He stood up, grabbed the roving microphone from a stunned event assistant, and strode towards the stage. "Friends, colleagues." He began, his voice booming artificially through the speakers. "It's wonderful to see such generosity tonight." A hush fell over the room. This was not on the program. As we look to the future, it's important to have a partner who shares that vision. A partner who is as modern, dynamic, and forward-thinking as the world we are trying to build. He paused and gestured dramatically towards his table. And I am the luckiest man in the world to have that partner in my incredible wife, Kimberly Croft. He waited for the applause. Instead, there was a dense, uncomfortable silence. People were frozen, glancing from Julian on the stage to Kimberly, who was trying to look demure to Elara, who had not moved a muscle. Elara simply took a sip of her water, her expression unreadable. Julian faltered. The silence was his condemnation. He had overplayed his hand so spectacularly that he had managed to unite the entire room, a cutthroat collection of rivals and allies, in a moment of collective second-hand embarrassment for him. He tried to recover. Kimberly and I are pleased to announce a new initiative, the Croft Foundation for Digital Innovation, with a founding pledge of $20 million. He had expected gasps. He got a few polite, scattered claps. The amount, while substantial, felt like a desperate gambit. It was blood money to buy back his own image. As he stood there stranded in the spotlight, the auctioneer, seeing his chance to regain control, quickly stepped in. "Thank you, Julian." A magnificent gesture. And now, before we continue with the auction, we have one final, very special announcement for the evening. I'd like to invite to the stage the woman who has been the heart and soul of this gala. For the past 5 years, the esteemed matriarch of New York philanthropy, Mrs. Evelyn Reed, Evelyn looking regal in Chanel tweed, walked slowly to the podium, leaning on a handsome mahogany cane. The applause for her was thunderous, genuine, and a stark contrast to the silence that had greeted Julian. Julian was forced to retreat to his table, his face a mask of thunderous fury. Kimberly reached for his hand, but he snatched it away. The unraveling was now complete. The lie had been told, and no one had believed it. The only thing left was for the truth to deliver the killing blow. Evelyn Reed reached the podium and adjusted the microphone, her movements as deliberate and weighted as a Supreme Court justice taking her seat. The applause that greeted her was not just polite. It was a wave of genuine, heartfelt relief. The room, thrown off balance by Julian's cringe-worthy display, was being righted by a figure of unimpeachable authority. Evelyn was old money, old power, old everything. She had seen men like Julian Croft rise and fall like the tides. She leaned into the microphone, and the entire ballroom fell silent. Even the clinking of cutlery ceased. "Thank you," she began, her voice a finely aged whiskey smooth, potent, and with a definite bite. "For 60 years I have had the privilege of attending events in this beautiful room. I have witnessed declarations of love, of war, and most frequently of spectacularly large egos." A knowing titter went through the audience. Her eyes, sharp and missing nothing, made a brief, sweeping survey of the room, managing to convey both warmth and a warning. They did not linger on Julian's table, but everyone felt the subtle chill as her gaze passed over it. "Tonight," she continued, "we gather under the banner of philanthropy. It's a wonderful word. It means literally love of humanity. A simple concept. Yet in our modern age it has become complicated. It has become entangled with branding, with marketing, with the laundering of reputations. The words were a direct hit. Julian, who had just tried to use a $20 million pledge as a reputation laundering service, felt his collar tighten. Kimberly's practiced smile was frozen on her face, a brittle, painted thing. "Legacy is not built on what you claim, Evelyn said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing the room in. "It is not cemented with a press release or a well-timed photo opportunity. It is built on what you create. It is forged in the quiet hours of dedicated work, in the intellectual rigor of identifying a problem, and the courage to propose a solution, even when that solution is not the most profitable or popular one." She let that sink in. The room was full of people who understood profit. The idea of prioritizing anything else was both foreign and fascinating. For the past several years, we have celebrated a new kind of creation, the digital world, an astonishing globe-spanning architecture of connection and information built by brilliant, ambitious minds. She paused. But creation without contemplation is a dangerous thing. We have built a global village and forgotten to write any laws. We have given our children the keys to the kingdom without teaching them how to rule. We have celebrated the disruptors, but we have failed to manage the disruption. The result is a deficit, not a financial deficit, but an ethical one. The Nobel economist at Ilara's table was nodding slowly, his expression rapt. Patricia Lawford's pen was flying across a napkin. She was taking notes. This wasn't a charity speech. It was a thesis. "It is my distinct honor tonight to announce the launch of an institution dedicated to addressing that deficit. An institution built not on ego but on intellect, not on branding but on a genuine love of humanity." The tension in the room was palpable. Something momentous was coming. "Therefore, it is my profound pleasure to announce the formation of the Vance Institute for Digital Ethics." The name dropped into the room like a bomb wrapped in velvet. Vance. Not Croft. Ilara's maiden name. The shock was instantaneous and seismic. A collective audible gasp swept through the ballroom. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Julian looked as though he'd been shot. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly pale mask of utter disbelief. He turned his head slowly, mechanically, to stare at Ilara, who remained perfectly still, a serene island in a sea of chaos. Kimberly's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The carefully constructed fantasy she had been living for the past 6 months had just been vaporized. Evelyn held up a hand for silence, a gesture of effortless command. "The Vance Institute is launching with an initial endowment of $75 million. If the first announcement was a bomb, this was the shockwave." The room erupted. 75 million. It was a number that commanded respect, even in this rarefied atmosphere. It dwarfed Julian's pledge, rendering it insignificant, almost insulting. Charles Baring let out a low whistle. Arthur Finch, the journalist, was grinning like a Cheshire cat, scribbling furiously in his notepad. The story had just gone from society gossip to the front page of the financial section. "This founding endowment," Evelyn announced, her voice cutting through the noise like a clarion call, "comes from the private family trust of its founder. It is her own money, earned and managed with a foresight that is, I must say, quite breathtaking." The implication was clear. This was not Croft money. This was Vance power. Furthermore, Evelyn's smile was now triumphant. "I am proud to announce that my own family's Reed Foundation, along with the Baring Foundation," she nodded graciously to a beaming Charles Baring, "and several other key partners represented in this room tonight have already pledged an additional $50 million in matching funds for the Institute's first 5 years of operation. $125 million. The number hung in the air, shimmering impossible. Julian Croft's world had just been revalued, and he was on the losing end of the trade. The Institute's first mandate, Evelyn declared, her voice ringing with the passion of a true believer, will be to develop and distribute an open-source K-12 curriculum on data privacy, algorithmic bias, and digital citizenship. It will be provided free of charge to any public school system in the country. It will directly address the ethical vacuum left by the very companies that have reshaped our world with little thought to the long-term consequences for our children. It was a perfectly executed maneuver. She had framed the entire tech industry, Julian's industry, as the villain, and she had just announced the hero who was riding in to save the day. Julian felt the floor drop out from under him. He was being publicly castrated, his life's work reframed as a societal poison, and the antidote was being funded and founded by the woman he had just tried to erase. And now Evelyn said, her voice softening, filled with genuine affection and pride. It is my great honor and personal joy to introduce the founder, the architect, and the visionary leader of this vital new enterprise, a woman of substance, intellect, and profound grace. Please welcome Miss Elara Vance. The standing ovation was a physical force, a roar of sound and approval that shook the crystal chandeliers. It was a release of all the evening's pent-up tension, a collective judgment, delivered on a tidal wave of applause. The room was united, not just for Elara, but against Julian. They were applauding her intelligence, her courage, and most of all, her exquisite, perfectly executed revenge. Elara rose from her seat. She walked to the stage with the same calm, unhurried grace with which she had entered the room hours earlier, a lifetime ago. She shook Evelyn's hand warmly and turned to face the audience, her audience now. She stood at the podium, a solitary, powerful figure in midnight blue, and waited with unnerving patience for the thunderous applause to die down. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was perfectly modulated, filled with a quiet, resonant power that sliced through the residual buzz and commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. "Thank you, Evelyn," she began, her voice steady. "And thank you all. For 12 years I have had the privilege of a front-row seat to the creation of the future. I have witnessed the genius, the relentless drive that has connected our world in ways we could have never imagined. It has been an education." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces, a gaze that was direct and inclusive, yet somehow managed to make Julian feel completely and utterly invisible. But with great power, she continued, comes a profound responsibility that cannot be outsourced or delegated. For too long, the human cost of innovation has been dismissed as an externality, a line item on a balance sheet that is never reconciled. The Vance Institute is my promise, and our promise, she said, gesturing elegantly towards Evelyn Charles and her other new partners to begin that reconciliation. It is a promise to the next generation, that we will not just give them more powerful tools, but we will give them the wisdom and the ethical framework to wield those tools for the betterment of humanity, not just the enrichment of a few. She was poised, articulate, and fiercely intelligent. She wasn't a scorned wife getting revenge. She was a stateswoman, a founder, a force to be reckoned with, laying out a manifesto. The work is vast, but it is essential, she concluded, her voice ringing with a conviction that was impossible to doubt. And it begins tomorrow. Thank you for being here tonight to witness its start. She gave a small, dignified nod. She did not smile a triumphant smile. She simply radiated a serene, unshakable confidence. She turned and walked off the stage, her task complete. She did not look back at the wreckage she had created. She did not need to. The spotlight which Julian had so desperately tried to steal for his mistress was now hers. He was left in the darkness, a ghost at his own gala, sitting at a table with the ruins of his reputation, and a woman who was now very publicly and irrevocably not his wife. The real wife had not just stolen the spotlight. She had become the sun around which the entire room now revolved. Elara did not flee the ballroom. Flight was an admission of guilt, a gesture of weakness. Instead, after her speech, she descended the stage and moved with deliberate calm back to her seat next to Evelyn Reed. She became a gravitational center. People didn't rush her, but a slow, respectful orbit formed. The Nobel economist leaned over his eyes alight with intellectual fire, already debating the finer points of implementing her curriculum. Patricia Lawford, the private equity titan, gave her a crisp, approving nod from a neighboring table, a gesture that was in their world the equivalent of a sworn blood oath of allegiance. They were no longer seeing Julian Croft's wife. They were seeing a peer, a formidable one. She allowed herself 10 minutes in this new reality. 10 minutes to cement her position. She laughed at a joke from Harrison Kane, she accepted a glass of champagne, and she listened intently as Charles Baring promised to connect her with his contacts in the Department of Education. Every moment was a performance of effortless command. She never once glanced towards the table where her husband sat, a black hole of rage, sucking all the light and joy from his immediate vicinity. She could feel his stare like a physical pressure, a hot, focused beam of impotent fury. Finally, she leaned towards Evelyn and squeezed her hand. "I think I've taken up enough of your evening, my dear," she murmured. "Nonsense," Evelyn whispered back, her eyes twinkling. "This is the most fun I've had since I outbid Aristotle Onassis for that island in 73. Go. The next phase begins now." Elara rose. The room seemed to hold its breath as she began her exit. It was a master class in subtlety. She glided between the tables, a word here, a brief smile there. It was a royal progression. As she passed the table where the gossip influencer sat, the young woman simply looked up at her with wide, awestruck eyes and whispered, "Iconic." Her path did not take her near Julian. She moved towards the grand exit on the opposite side of the ballroom, a route she had planned in her mind hours before. The driver she had hired, not the company car Julian used, but a private service loyal only to her, would be waiting at the east entrance, away from the paparazzi scrum at the front. She was almost at the door when a hand grabbed her arm, not roughly, but with a desperate proprietary grip. Julian. He had crossed the entire ballroom, a crimson-clad Kimberly, trailing in his wake like a gaudy, panicked shadow. His face was a thunderous mask, his eyes burning. "Where do you think you're going?" He hissed, his voice low and venomous. Elara slowly turned her head and looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up to his face. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her look of pure, unadulterated disgust was enough. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. "You planned this," he accused, his voice shaking with rage. "You set out to humiliate me." "Humiliation is a choice, Julian," she replied, her voice as cold and clear as ice water. "You made yours when you asked me to sit this one out. I simply made mine. This institute," he spat the word, "this little vanity project. Where did you get that kind of money? Did you embezzle it?" The accusation was so absurd, so revealing of his own transactional worldview, that Elara almost laughed. Kimberly, standing behind him, flinched. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a multi-vehicle pileup, completely out of her depth. Julian Elara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to lean in and listen, a final subtle assertion of control. You are making a scene. And you have been the star of far too many scenes tonight. Let me be very clear. My finances are my own. They always have been. You were so busy building your empire, you never bothered to look at the one I was quietly managing right beside you. She turned to leave. You're not going anywhere, he snarled, taking a step after her. We are going home. Our home. And we are going to fix this. Elara paused at the threshold of the grand doorway. She turned back, and for the first time she allowed a sliver of what looked like pity to enter her expression. There is no we anymore, Julian. There is no our home. I am going to my hotel. And you? You are going to be very, very busy tomorrow. And with that, she swept out of the ballroom, leaving him standing there, exposed and defeated, with the entire New York elite as his audience. The car ride to the Carlisle was silent. Elara leaned her head back against the cool leather and closed her eyes, the adrenaline of the evening finally beginning to recede, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. This wasn't a victory to be celebrated with champagne. It was a necessary amputation, painful, bloody, but essential for survival. She had secured the presidential suite weeks ago under an assumed name. Her bags, packed by a discreet service, were already in the closets. The suite was a world away from the cold, modernist glass box she had shared with Julian. It was old-world elegance, deep wood paneling, plush velvets, priceless antiques. It felt like a sanctuary, a fortress. She had just taken off the sapphire earrings and placed them on the mahogany dresser when the frantic, insistent buzz came from the suite's intercom. The front desk. Ms. Vance. I am so terribly sorry to disturb you. There is a Mr. Croft in the lobby. He is very insistent that he be allowed to come up. Elara walked over to the window. 34 floors below the lights of Manhattan glittered. A city of 8 million people, and all she felt was a profound solitude. Tell Mr. Croft, she said, her voice firm, that Ms. Vance is not receiving any visitors. If he does not leave the premises, you have my permission to call hotel security. A few moments of silence, and then a new voice on the intercom, raw and desperate. Julian had obviously grabbed the phone from the concierge. Elara, let me in. We need to talk. You can't do this. She simply pressed the button to disconnect the call. He was used to getting his way to his voice being the one that commanded attention. The silence he was now met with would be more infuriating to him than any argument. 20 minutes later, the inevitable happened. A furious pounding on her suite door. He must have bribed or bullied his way past the front desk and elevator security. Elara took a deep breath. She walked to the door, her silk gown whispering against the floor. She did not open it. Go away, Julian, she said, her voice calm and even through the thick wood. Open this damn door. Elara, you owe me an explanation. After everything I've given you. What you've given me. Her voice was laced with a dangerous irony. You've given me late nights of worry, the scent of another woman's perfume on my clothes and public humiliation. I think we're even. That money, he roared, his voice muffled, but his rage clear. 75 million. Where did it come from? That's our money. That's Ethelred's money. It is the Vance family money. Julian, from my grandfather. The inheritance I received the year before we married, the one you called a nice little nest egg. I invested it. I grew it. While you were building Ethelred with leveraged debt and high-risk acquisitions, I was building my own fortune with discipline and foresight. I never touched a dollar of our marital assets. Ask your lawyers. They'll find it's all perfectly firewalled. I made sure of it. There was a stunned silence from the other side of the door. She had just detonated his entire perception of her. He had seen her as a dependent, an elegant accessory to his success. He had never imagined she had her own arsenal, and the institute she continued pressing her advantage is not a vanity project. It's a direct response to the ethical rot at the heart of your industry. A rot you have willfully ignored. While you were chasing valuations, the world was waking up to the damage your products were causing. The Vance Institute is not an attack on you, Julian. It's simply ahead of the curve. Something you used to be. A key card rattled in the lock. Kimberly. He must have brought her with him. The door swung open. Julian stood there, his face contorted in a mask of disbelief and fury. Behind him, Kimberly. Sterling looked small and terrified, her crimson dress now looking garish and cheap in the soft lighting of the suite. You think you can just walk away? Julian advanced into the room. And what? Take half of everything I've built? Elara didn't move. On the marble-topped console table next to the door was a single and elegant navy blue folder. She picked it up. I don't want half of Ethelred, Julian. I don't want your stock options or your bonuses. I don't want this penthouse or the house in the Hamptons. All of that is tainted. It's yours. She held the folder out to him. These are the divorce papers. My lawyers drew them up last week. The terms are very simple. I am dissolving our marriage. I am reverting to my maiden name, and I am waiving any and all claims to your fortune. He stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. You're waiving it, all of it. You built your empire on the ethos of disruption, she said. Consider this my disruption of our marriage. I want nothing from you. A clean break. Julian was speechless. He was a man who understood transactions, leverage negotiations. This was something else. An absolute rejection. It was a move so powerful in its simplicity that he had no counter for it. He had come here ready for a fight over money, expecting tears and recriminations. Instead, he was being met with a level of indifference so profound it was like an erasure of his entire existence. His eyes fell on Kimberly, who was cowering by the door, and his humiliation curdled into a new targeted rage. He needed a victim. He needed someone to blame. Get out, he snarled, not at Elara, but at Kimberly. What she stammered. Julian, I said, get out, he roared, his voice cracking. This is your fault, you and your stupid PR strategy, projecting a unified front. You pushed for this, you wanted to be seen. Well, look around. Everyone saw you. They saw you for what you are, a cheap social climbing little consultant. He threw the final word at her, like an epithet. The dream died in Kimberly's eyes. The fantasy of becoming Mrs. Julian Croft of yachts and galas, and a life of effortless luxury dissolved into the cheap, sordid reality. She was a contract employee, and her contract had just been violently terminated. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. With a choked sob, she turned and fled down the hallway. Julian stood panting in the center of the magnificent suite, a deposed king in a borrowed room. He looked at Elara, a final desperate plea in his eyes. He was searching for the woman he had married, the partner who had once soothed his rages and celebrated his victories. He found no trace of her. In her place was Miss Vance. "You should go now, Julian," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "You have an emergency board meeting at 7 a.m. I hear they're very concerned about the Arion Labs acquisition. Apparently some troubling risk factors have come to light. The final blow. It wasn't just personal. It was business. She wasn't just leaving him. She was positioning herself to become his rival, or worse, his replacement. He finally took the folder from her hand, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the suite, out of her life. Elara closed the door and leaned against it, the silence of the room flooding back in. She did not cry. She did not smile. She simply stood there breathing. It was over. The marriage was a casualty, a piece of collateral damage in her fight for her own soul. Her phone buzzed on the dresser. She picked it up. 2 new messages had arrived on the secure app. The first was from Arthur Finch. Front page of the journal confirmed. "They're running the photo of you alone. They're calling it the philanthropist's coup." Need a quote for the headline. Your words. The second was from Marcus Thorne. "The board is in panic mode. They want to know your price to consult on the Arion deal. They want you to present your risk analysis at the 7 a.m. meeting. Name your terms, Elara." Any terms. Elara walked to the vast window and looked out at the city lights, which no longer seemed so lonely. They looked like a promise, a kingdom waiting. She thought for a moment, then typed her reply to Arthur Finch. The headline is, "The future is ethical. Elara Vance is building it." She had won the battle. The war for the future was just beginning. And so in the space of a single evening, the world shifted. Julian Croft's brazen act of public betrayal backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. He didn't just lose control of the narrative. He became a footnote in his own wife's triumphant story. The headlines the next day weren't about his paltry donation or his new wife. They were about Elara Vance, the brilliant, quiet strategist who stepped out of the shadows to launch one of the most significant philanthropic ventures of the decade. Her move wasn't born of simple revenge. It was a masterclass in power strategy and reclaiming one's identity. She didn't tear her husband down. She simply built her own castle so high that his looked like a shack in its shadow. What did you think of Elara's checkmate move? Was it the ultimate power play? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of drama betrayal and ultimate triumph, where the underestimated rise up to take what is rightfully theirs, then make sure you hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most compelling stories of real-life drama every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.